Hello, my name is Brian Lewis and I'm an instructor at J10S. Today we're going to talk about fall protection in buckets, ladders, and platforms. As usual, I'm going to ask you to pause the video at this time and talk about any near misses or accidents you might have had in the previous month. Have a good discussion, make sure you don't have those happen again, and then we will continue with our presentation on fall protection, buckets, ladders, and platforms. Hopefully you had a good discussion. First up, we're going to talk about buckets. Some of you may not use buckets, or if you do, not very often, but they're full of fall trip hazards. There's all kinds of situations where if you fail to consider what you're doing, taking time during that job briefing, taking time 5 minutes when you do something new, look at it with fresh eyes as much as you can, and then decide what you need to do. This can happen when you're talking about working out of a bucket. So we want you to inspect pre-fly trucks before each use. Keep bed and slide board walkways clear of debris and material. Now, slip, trip, and fall hazards can happen before you even reach the bucket. So it's important that we realize this and try to take care of that as much as possible. As much as possible, we want to address those issues. So, when you enter a bucket, you always have to tie off using a harness and lanyard. You want to make sure the anchor or anchorage point is adequate. What does that mean? That means it has to support 5,000 pounds for a person. You never want to lift or move a lift with the worker elevated. There's been plenty of accidents you can find on the internet where people have been killed and seriously hurt. And as with any piece of equipment, you want to be properly trained so that you understand what you're doing and how to use the equipment safely. You, of course, want to maintain your equipment. That means do your inspections, make sure the controls are properly marked, people understand how to use them. Never override the safety devices for outriggers or anything else, and know the swing radius. Know how to keep clear of that swing radius because you can have impacts with people on the ground or inadvertently hit the bucket against something. We want to avoid that at all possible. Of course, you want to set your brakes. You want to use wheel chocks. Always check your tire pressure, extend the outriggers, use pads, especially on soft ground or in the summer. We all know blacktop, once it gets hot, moves. So we want to make sure we spread that pressure out over a wide area so that we don't have the truck moving. Make sure the lift is level, absolutely level. It's imperative that it's level so that it can function properly. So, as far as the environment goes, you never want to operate a bucket truck in high winds. The bucket can act as a sail and tip the bucket and the truck completely over. You always want to make sure that your work zone is as safe as can be, and if you have to set up a temporary traffic control zone, that you do it properly. Always maintain minimum approach distance of 10 feet around distribution lines up to 50,000 kilovolt or volts. So make sure you do that. Make sure you take the proper precautions if you go beyond that minimum approach distance as far as training, etc. We want to talk about ladders now. Ladders, you can use them in the field, you can use them in warehouses, you can use them in shops, you use them in office, you use them at home. And a ladder can be a really good stable work platform if you use it correctly. but you can also get yourself really hurt bad if you don't use it correctly. So we're just going to go over a few rules and how to use ladders, and there are at least three types of ladders that we'll address. As we go into the next slide, you will see that what we are talking about is using step ladders, straight ladders, and extension ladders. Now, each one of these ladders can fulfill a particular or a particular purpose, depending on what the situation is. Step ladders are wonderful tools, just like extension ladders are. And they can, like I said, present unique opportunities to reach landing areas where you get off, do work, that sort of thing. It's important that we use them correctly. So, some ladder rules for the operator, and talking about step ladders. First things first, you have to know the load capacity. You've got to know how much you weigh, how much the ladder can withstand. Do not forget to include the tools and equipment you take up the ladder. So that's what belts and backpacks and other things are for. You want to inspect for defects. If it's a wet ladder, you're pretty much going to be limited to a ladder with wooden rungs, and you want to adjust and take precautions in high traffic areas and doorways especially. So you do not want to reach outside of the rails in any ladder in particular. That's where the ladder is the strongest. That's where it has the most stability. You want to make sure that you do not use ladders in the proximity of live components. If you do, make sure it's not aluminum. Maintain a 3-point contact. Like I said, that's what tool belts are for. Backpacks are for. Once you get up there, have somebody send you something up there, or it's equipment, and you want to climb the ladder facing the ladder, not away from it. You climb it away from it, there's a chance your heel can dig into the rung and it'll send you flying. So step ladders, you obviously don't want to stand on the top two rungs. It creates a lot of instability. You can fall off, seriously hurt yourself, or die. You do not want to paint a ladder. If you paint it, you can cause problems with the inspection process where you can't see cracks and defects in the ladder. You don't want to leave tools and materials on the ladder where it can fall off and hurt somebody. You definitely do not want to use it as a pickboard, and you do not want to use a step ladder as a straight ladder. It's not designed for that use, and you don't want to use it that way. Proper tool, proper use. With extension ladders, just like step ladders, you want to know the capacity, the person plus the tools. You want to inspect it for defects. You want to allow sufficient room to step off of the ladder. What does that mean? OSHA requires that you have 3 feet of ladder beyond the landing area that you're going to get off. So there's 12 inches between each rung, so you need to see 3 rungs. You want to use a proper angle of 25 degrees. That's how ladders are designed and engineered to be used, and that's how we want to use them, to make sure that they don't slip out from underneath us or anything else bad happens. So you want to look for potential hazards around the area. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about impalement hazards. We're talking about wrought iron, stakes, anything that if you fell off that ladder and you landed on it, it could penetrate your body, or you can hit your head on something and create a serious head injury. You want to use non-conductive ladder around electrical components, and you want to make sure the dogs are secured and the safety latch is secured. You definitely do not want to ride an extension ladder if those dogs slip. You also want to make sure it's on even ground, set up on an even surface. You want to secure it to prevent vertical and lateral movement. The best way to do this is actually have somebody you trust to hold the ladder and foot it so that it can't move, but there are other ways you can do that as well. If you want to know some more ways, please contact us. We'll try and make sure we give you that information. There are hooks where you can hook ladders up, and of course maintain 3 points of contact just like any other ladder. So when we talk about platforms, fixed platforms and elevations, we're talking about catwalks, roofs, tops of large equipment, anything that gets you above the operating or normal walking working surface, whether it's the ground, whether it's concrete in a warehouse, whether it's gravel. Doesn't really matter what the working surface is made out of, but anytime you're elevated above it, we have to find some rules. And so we'll talk a little bit about construction rules and a little bit about general industry rules. It's important to know what you're doing at certain situations. So OSHA requires that employees be protected from falls from heights. What are we talking about here? If you're doing something in general industry, that's 4 foot off the ground. If it's construction, it's 6 foot off the ground. If you're working from a scaffold, we're talking about 10 foot above the ground. You must be protected from falls into dangerous chemicals or machinery. So screw conveyors, change pulleys, all that sort of thing, as well as any kind of chemical like sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid, anything that can really hurt you in a bad way, no matter how high away from it you are, if it's on the same level. Like I said, in general industry, heights of 4 feet or more you need to be protected from. Top rails need to be 42 inches plus or minus 3 inches. Mid rails halfway in between. Toe boards to keep from kicking stuff off on people below, like tools and equipment. Now, what's important here to remember is they're only required to support 200 pounds in any direction. So these are warning devices. They're warning devices. They're not going to support or not required to support a tremendous amount of force. Keep that in mind. In construction, where new work's being done or you're doing substantial removal of pipes or some other obstruction to replace existing equipment and putting new in, they're going to call that construction. And in construction, as I've already said, if you are 6 foot or more, you have to have some kind of fall protection, whether it's guardrails with a top rail and a mid rail, or a harness and lanyard, or a positioning device. Any kind of fall protection, as long as it's done correctly and adequately, is what is important. Mobile platforms. Bucket trucks are not the only means that we get to elevated jobs that we have to do. Each type has a specific regulation and fall protection requirements. We're going to talk about those, get you familiar with them, so that when it comes time to use these pieces of equipment, you'll be have some adequate knowledge so that you can use them safely. And that's really what's important, is safe use. Proper tool, proper job, use it in the correct manner, and things tend to go well. So mobile platforms, there are basically two types of mobile platforms. They're scissor lifts and vertical lifts. These typically have a chassis and a frame, and they go straight up vertically and straight down. That is one type of mobile platform. Another type is an articulating boom or aerial lift or elevated platform, mobile elevated platform. And these tend to have articulating booms that allow the platform to move beyond the chassis of the device. So scissor lifts, vertical lifts, they quite typically move straight up and down just like their names. Typically have guardrails are installed for fall protection. The basket does not move outside the perimeter of the chassis, like I've already said. It's important to know this. If there is not an anchorage point that supports 5,000 pounds, do not tie off to the guardrails. Those guardrails only support 200 pounds in any direction, or are only required to support that. They are not going to support you if you fall, and most likely. Scissor lifts and vertical lifts. Typically, there's no OSHA regulations at the time we're making this video for requires a harness and lanyard. Some have been engineered and have tie-off points. You want to follow the manufacturer's recommendations for that. You want to stay on the deck of the lift. When you use a ladder or a pick board or stand on the guardrails, you are defeating the fall protection of the guardrails that are there. You're taking a risk and you're exposing yourself to a fall. So no ladders, pick boards, or standing on the guardrails. So when we talk about articulating booms and aerial lifts, the basket can be positioned well beyond the chassis of the equipment, as we've already said. Some can be driven only when the platform is stowed, but some can be driven when the platform is elevated. It's important to know that everything that happens on the ground is magnified when you're on that elevated platform and when it's moved outside the chassis. What may be 2 to 4 inches down here may be 2, 3, 4 feet up in the air, depending on how that elevated platform is positioned. So we want to be careful with that. Articulating booms and aerial lifts, if you look at the OSHA regulations, OSHA 29 CFR 1926.453, paragraph B2, 4, man, that was a mouthful. Employees shall always stand firmly on the floor of the basket and shall not sit or climb on the edge of the basket or use planks, ladders, or other devices for a work position. We've already spoken about this in the last slide, but it bears repeating. It's an OSHA violation. You don't want to do it. You're putting yourself at risk and exposing yourself to a fall, potentially, if you do those things. 29 CFR 1926.453, paragraph B25, requires a harness and lanyard be worn for fall arrest system. Body belts can only be worn for tethering or a restraint system. So harness and lanyard need to be inspected. They need to be attached to an anchor point that has been inspected and you know it will hold 5,000 pounds. Body belts are not used for fall arrest because, as the next slide will show, I think it's the next slide anyway, when you wear body belts and for fall arrest, you are taking a risk, and they're never recommended, they're never required for fall arrest system because severe back injuries. There's a lot of documented injuries where people have severe back injuries. I encourage people to destroy and get rid of body belts. If you're going to use it for a positioning system like a dog on a leash, then you just use the harness. It doesn't take that much longer to put a harness on, and if you get body belts out of your system, then you don't have to worry about someone picking up and misusing a piece of equipment. So why articulating booms and aerial lifts treated differently? As I've said before, there is a significant risk of being ejected out of the basket. That goes for basket trucks, as we talked about earlier. There is an ANSI A92 standard that requires articulating booms and aerial lifts to be manufactured with anchor points withstanding 5,000 pounds per person. So you can't have multiple people attached to the same anchor point unless it has more capacity. So I appreciate your participation. I appreciate your attention. Please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact your JTNS representative and instructor. We'll do everything we can to get you an answer if we don't know the answer right away. Thank you. Have a great week.